generation of branding stars. The difference is that you ever know a building by Mario Botta or Frank Gehry is, you immediately realized who did it. Not so by the branding stars like Graham Kohlhaas or Herzog Demerow. They try to be not defined in one style and to have different expressions on the different projects. I remember Jacques Herzog did in a questionnaire in around 2000 about the future of architecture. He was thinking about that star architects should have a second line of their production. So the first line is the original one, the huge buildings like in the fashion industry, and then they should have a more cheap line for clients which cannot pay for big buildings or big signatures. So, and I said to him, yes, you know the shorten of Herzog Demerow is HDM. And I say, okay, Jacques, you should create HDM like H&M. So I think this is an example of this branding strategy. It's from an exhibition of Oma collecting all the working models from the office. I think afterwards Herzog Demerow did the same, showing all what they have, all the stuff they have in the office, all what they prepared in concepts and forms. And as I asked in a discussion with Jacques Herzog in Basel some years ago about this strategy of his exhibition, I say, is the message of this exhibition that you tell all the architectural students and all the other architects in the world that it's you who already researched all possible forms in the world and nobody else should do this anymore? And he said, yes. But he's a real 20 years of mine. So I still love his work. But until this question has been cleared up, keep swarming out into the real world, the everyday world. My dream is a commitment of intelligent and pragmatic task forces which intervene in situations in real life, which disrupt the everyday run of consumerism, opening up new life worlds, designing houses or just interventions in the public space, and perhaps even build them with their own hands. Imagine all these masses of students hidden away in overcrowded in front of computer screens around the clock, just waiting to be sucked into the industrial standard of programs that configures them. I have a proposal for you. Because I'm sure you don't know it. There was a small interesting movie in the 80s, I think it was by Disney. It was called Drawn. It was one of the earliest movies with a lot of computer animated parts. In it, of the movie was that a young guy programming his computer catched into the computer and has to live in the software system. It's a quite nice movie, but from the 80s you should not be impressed by the technology of animation. So it's a history about it. So why should we not imagine that this mass is swarming out into the reality of our cities and villages and simply starting to really change our concrete situations with real means? I think it's necessary because suddenly they start to become a social necessity. That would be, I think, architecture. But I've heard today that Rural Studio was already here in Skopje. But I'm seeing in the last years a lot of projects and people which set up exactly this kind of a task force all over in Vienna, in Johannesburg, in Madrid, throughout the world. So I think you already know the projects by Rural Studio, which was founded by Sam Markby. That also leads to emotional involvement among the actors, above and beyond the gain in knowledge regarding the planning and execution. For no one who has experienced such a situation firsthand, just like this group of students from Vienna in Johannesburg in South Africa, will ever be able to engage in academic investor arrogance in their life again without scruples or cynism. This, let's say, performative interventions are not academic excursions either, but rather a cooperation with local actors that also leads to empowerment them. Set an example regarding solidarity and commitment. They leave behind hope and span out the space of possibilities. By no means sentimental to see a theoretical future of architecture too in these activities. Only with these approaches to working in real situations can we conceive as a union of academic, culturally advanced standards of architecture with the necessity of building with social responsibility. Under the world dominion of consumerism, a current emancipatory architecture can only devote itself to archiving marginalized ways of life and saving what it's overlooked. This architecture could not orient itself to prevailing aesthetics and social codes, but rather would have to devote itself to odious bare life today. Today it is no more and no less a matter of the future justification of the necessity of architecture, whoever does it and wherever, just like this project in Johannesburg, or in unfinished houses. So I'm coming to an end and starting in the dirtiness. This is not the dirtiness you see here, but it's the question of the end of attention also. We are currently seeing what are probably the death throes of an economy of attention in which the innovative force of architecture still plays a role. Our indicator of this is the new type of renderings. You see these examples of renderings have a disastrous aesthetic effect, I think. They make all images of all projects the same. That explains that claim that there are no longer good or bad projects today. For at the end of the presentation, they all look the same and speak the same aesthetic language. Today's image creation computer software has an even more effect on the architectural project. They suggest the easy possibility at a click of the mouse on the screen of creating irregular, free, organic forms of design that convey to the public a kind of uniqueness and spectacularity that is increasingly in demand today. The building client wants to have the most unique, the most sensational office tower, sensational museum, and so on, or shopping center. And more clients call for tender, and programs today demand that the architecture give a project a unique symbolic character. And the software for this purpose is there and it is used. Even for this. As all architects the world over now have the same technical tools and chances to present a project at their disposal, it no longer matters whether the professional is celebrated star architect or at least, with all due respect, a talented Mexican or Mongolian architectural student. That all sounds perfectly normal, but behind it all, it is a dramatic architecture. For when a client is faced with these images of very different professional provenance, he can no longer distinguish or decide whether the perfect renderings that suggest the desired architectural sensations are in fact buildable or not. So I think now the crisis of the last year will allow us to say the truth of all these rendering projects, and I think a lot of them will not build anymore. I think again Rem Koolhaas knew already this situation and realized it and stated at the beginning in an interview of 2009 that now is, as he said, the end of star architects. And the global experience of recent years with this spectacular project, which born of the possibilities of today's computer software, sought to make infinite free-form buildings its sovereign. Whenever one of these buildings of spectacularity was celebrated by the media around the globe, there was no mention in the actual costs involved. The incunabulum of this, I mentioned it before, in this new architecture is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao by Frank Gehry. Really nobody knows that this spectacle was only possible because the contract between Guggenheim and the government of Basque region stipulated that Guggenheim and Gehry could design whatever they wanted, and the Basque government had to pay all the costs. The Guggenheim effect, as it now known, has caused more and more people to covet comparable spectacular buildings in recent years, and the renderings promised to deliver just that. Yeah. Where in the world? What else? Yeah, Mercedes Museum. But now, the twilight of the gods, or the German that word is more dramatically Götterdämmerung, is in the offing because many of these designs turn out to be simply unbuildable or unaffordable. So, because Wolf Brick's Babel Metapher needs, as I said before, patrons and not clients. And the buildings that feel obliged to this standard are almost always only feasible with vast additional costs and unique technological contortions that often enough can hardly be referred to as a productive development of the building industry. So only Mercedes can build a Mercedes museum, and that only once. And also Porsche can build a Porsche museum, and that only once. I know the costs of all this building, the published and the real one, or the Fino building by Zaha Hadid, which I can say it free. It's really, it really not functions in this way. That to the roots of architecture, as you see in this hut in the forest, following a bottom-up strategy, and I think to forget for a while the top-down strategy from the global fashion designers. So what we have to learn from situation minimum for the given nature to keep your body. So the simple rural hut, the farmhouse, here is mentioned in an artistic performance by the Scandinavian architect Sami Rintala. He had a quite interesting position also. He said, okay, and I share this position in a way, okay, the next future is announced that more than 50% of world population will be in cities, will live in cities, so we have to took all our concentration on the development of cities, of the change, sustainability. Sustainability. And all the research in architecture and urban planning is doing on cities at the moment. And Sami Rintala said, okay, 50% in cities, but what is going on with the other 50%? And so he concentrated on the rural situation, and this performance he did, he picked up old Norwegian farmhouses on these columns. So as a symbol, the farmers are walking to the city, leaving the country with the houses, and the houses get burned. And he did it in reality. So I think also an invisible architecture will gain ground once again, which feels obliged to sustainability and minimizing building costs, while increasing physical, atmospheric, and haptic sensorial quality, like the projects of Lacaton and Vassal. Maybe you know them. Their strategy is to not to build cheap buildings, but uses the given amount of money for a building to enlarge the space and minimum the costs of the houses. Or this wonderful example, the Palais Tokyo in Paris, building from the 30s, and was rearranged and readapted for an art museum for the Palais Tokyo by Lacaton Vassal, with interesting reactions by the audience, which are with, you don't see this. Okay, a bit, yeah. So it's a complete rough structure, and they let it as it was, and give the space free for the artists and the visitors, all which were coming to the this museum, are asking when will the renovation start, but is already done. And a nice anecdote is you see this caravan where you can, normally it's a rolling kiosk for sausages, selling sausages or something like this, and they went try to bring one used kiosk here in the museum, but the smell was really not fitting to the situation, so they had to buy a new one and roll it into the museum. Or another one is a Chinese architect, Wang Shu, which I'm really interested in. He works in Hangzhou, and maybe some of you know, realize that he did in 2006 at the Venice Biennale, in Architecture Biennale, in this garden behind the buildings, as a Chinese contribution to the Biennale, this huge roof with totally, I think, millions of used tiles from China. I'm a bit sorry that you can't see the details of this. Or he built a university in Hangzhou using traditional materials and including also for the landscape and for the common spaces outside and surrounding this university, this kind of agricultural statements. And he called his architectural office, because he called himself more as a philosopher than an architect, and he called his office Amateur Studio. And he explained in an interview what amateur studio means. So, built spontaneously, illegally, and temporarily, amateur architecture challenges professional architecture, but is generally considered to be insignificant. Professional architects think of buildings too much as physical objects, in my opinion, so they can learn from amateurs in this respect. So these architectural propositions I showed at the end, and there are a lot other more to be included in the future, proves itself through its handling of everyday life, its immediacy, appropriateness, and suitability for life. This architecture already exists as a present and esoteric parallel world. In order to perceive its qualities, we will, however, have to cultivate and hone our senses. We are nearing the close of the first decade of the new millennium. At the end of the last millennium, I dare no hope that architecture would once again exist beyond the media spectacle. But this reset has now taken place, I'm sure. We are at the beginning of a new architecture, and for this we have to reuse the existing surroundings more than before. It's, as in this building in Katowice by Polkoloft, lamp building by Medusa Group, using an old industrial plant for new purposes, or a project at the University of Graz with students in reusing everyday materials you get in the shops for being for reusing them for a new use, or a very beautiful small exhibition we had about bus stations of Estonia. They are not under heritage, and I think most of them are destroyed now. I love very much to minimalize the icon of a bus station. And the young architect who did this research on the bus stations in Estonia draw a map with, like a touristic heritage map of the icons of Estonia. All this temporary installation done in Vienna